From the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University, this is Human-Centered. Divisive, digital, micro-targeted disinformation efforts, especially those that are undisclosed or dark, exert a measurable effect on voter turnout and political participation. But how do we uncover this if the alleged activities are hidden? In part, it's through innovative tools and methods devised by scholar Young Mie Kim and her collaborators that reverse engineer the algorithms behind disinformation ads to reveal the evidence. Today on Human-Centered, a conversation with Young Mie Kim, a 2023-24 CASBS Fellow and Professor of Mass Communication at the University of Wisconsin. Kim led a project that used a novel real-time ad exposure tracking tool to empirically investigate the sources and sponsors behind targeted dark ad practices during presidential election campaigns. She then mapped these findings onto the real-world political behavior of users to estimate the extent of voter mobilization or suppression. Her work won an award and garnered extensive media coverage that we'll link to in the episode notes. And she'll walk us through that work in conversation with renowned former New York Times tech journalist and Pulitzer Prize winner John Markoff, a 2017-18 CASBS Fellow and a familiar voice to us here on Human-Centered. As you'll hear, John also interrogates Young Mie's work during her CASBS year and beyond, which seeks to push the frontiers of her previous groundbreaking findings. The goal is to elucidate how algorithms and the data underlying them influence the distribution of political information and representation, how they intensify political inequalities by disproportionately impacting vulnerable or underserved populations, how they amplify subtle yet extremist voices, and how they exploit fundamental structural problems of our information environment and thus degrade the integrity of democratic systems and the media. Needless to say, that's a lot, even without quantifying any Russian involvement. But yeah, you'll hear about that too. So let's listen.
You know, there's this tradition at CASBS that I think that you're familiar with about the ghosts in your study and the people who occupied your study before. And you mentioned in a note that Phil Converse had been in your study some years before you were. And I was wondering if you could talk just a little bit about his work, how it's related to your work.
Sure. So Phil Converse is a political scientist who studied public opinion. And his argument, he's like a survey researchers, and then his argument is that people mass attitudes are not stable. So people answer the survey questions on top of the head, so their attitudes, opinions are not consistent over time, not stable, not so strong. So that's about an entire book. But then last chapter, just one paragraph. By the way, there are certain segment of the population who seem to have a strong, consistent, and stable attitudes. And then probably because they are caring about some issues because of their personal importance. Let's call them issue publics. So this concept of issue publics are sort of an auxiliary concept, meaning that he accidentally found it and then tried to explain the puzzles that he couldn't explain based on his original theory. So that is a long time ago, 60s, and then he stopped there. There are some people, like John Krosnick, also former CASBS fellow, try to identify issue publics by using a survey method. So how to measure a personal importance. I read these John Krosnick's and then Phil Converse works when I was in graduate study, and then I was just fascinated by the concepts. I think that as digital era person in the digital media information environment, which is very pluralistic, there is no like a amorphous like the general public who could be react to like the media messages or information environment in a very uniform way. So I assume that like maybe like this is the time that like issue publics are more activated and facilitated. So I try to develop, revisit, field converse the notion of issue publics, and then develop this concept further in the data-driven information environment.
Speak about that a little bit in the context of an audience or a mass, which is of that era. But it seems like even before the internet, I mean, internet makes possible micro-targeting and precision, but you could walk door to door to people's homes in the past and contact individuals, and probably where are the things similar and where are they different? Is the difference that we're no longer in this era of treating the audience as a mass?
Yeah, so it's not that like issue publics are suddenly created like by the information environment. Yes, like you said, like issue publics always existed. But what I emphasize is that instead of conceptualizing the public or mass as amorphous like an entity, one entity, let's see like society as the one that consists of like a pluralistic groups of people who have like a strong interest in particular types of issues because of their values or because of their identities or because of their self-interest. Like for example, gun owners are interested in gun right issues because of a self-interest and its implications for their daily lives. Some people care about abortion because of religious values. Some people care about like racial issues or racial conflict because of their racial identities. In the past, like let's say like a broadcast era, when broadcast media was a dominant like a source of information, these people cannot determine their own agenda. Their information-seeking behavior was very limited. Also, their organization ability, like organizing people who share the same interests, was also limited. Probably just a local community, limited to like a local community. But now with the internet, they can find the information they care about, even though it was not like a national agenda, like journalists emphasize or politicians like emphasize, and then they can self-organize themselves like on the internet. But then the big shift, I think, like the more fundamental shift, I personally think that it is micro-targeting, the ability or the shift. The ability to identify, target, and mobilize or even demobilize certain groups of people. And then that's definitely like a dramatic shift from targeting based on arbitrary groups like to targeting and then messaging and customizing messaging and then media placement based on like a basically individual. Yeah, it is essentially possible to like identify and target each and every individual in the United States.
So let's talk a little bit about the players in this new information environment that you've defined here. And clearly you can see the political parties, the candidates themselves and the candidates' organizations. There are foreign actors who now can access this, and they can all use these. They now have new levers, you're arguing, to get at issue publics with great precision and perhaps effectiveness.
That's right. Like, that's exactly my argument.
And how democratic or anti-democratic is that?
I mean, like a micro-targeting per se, it's hard to say like whether it is like democratic or anti-democratic in a binary way, in a dichotomous way. It is. I just see it as sort of like a design. Like so, yes, it is fundamental technological attributes like that explains the the characteristics of the data-driven information environment. Everything is based on the data, and then the strategies or technologies like a micro-targeting technologies like enable like anyone like to identify, target, and then mobilize or demobilize like a people. But then like that is who has like a data and who has like a micro-targeting like a capability. That's the issue that we need to think about. Some people argue that like a micro-targeting is basically like the core idea is that everyone receives or everyone like exposed to like different messages. So some people argue it could be like a very democratic or very anti-democratic, depending on who are using it and how.
So transparency is important in terms of this question of democratic versus.
Right, but even before that, I want to emphasize that. So then, who has like a data? There is definitely like information like asymmetry. We don't have a lot of data about like other people, but certain campaigns have a lot of data about the entire population. So we have to take into account that kind of thing. So then, to make it like more democratic, then like, I think like transparency is important. Who are using, micro-targeting capability, technologies, and then who are targeting with what kind of messages, who are trying to influence whom. I think that is really important to understand the implications of like this data-driven information environment.
Before you came to CASBS, you had 2 election cycles to look at and see the behavior that was going on in this internet world. Let me start by asking you what your charter was that you set yourself out when you came here. What questions did you want to address in your research during your CASBS year?
Yeah, so viewing like a micro-targeting as a fundamental and distinctive attributes of the data-driven information environment, current information environment, I wanted to study basically who are using like a micro-targeting and who are targeted with what kind of messages and what's the effect of like a micro-targeting, how much like it is effective in mobilizing people in terms of like elections, like voter turnout, or whether that actually influences like election outcomes. Because I've been studying like this concept of issue publics, I've known a lot of like advocacy groups. And with the micro-targeting, available on all the social media, with like a really convenience menu, for example, like a Facebook provides like all this like ads targeting tools, and then so even people who don't understand like marketing or targeting like strategies, that they can just put like a keywords like gun owners, like a Second Amendment, and then like they can identify like people who are interested in gun or things like that, and then they can narrow down to like a very neighborhood level, like a community. So it's not like a broadcast media. It's all like your campaign messages are tethered by this arbitrary like a media market. We in the United States we have 210 like a media markets, but like now you can technically identify and target like every and each individual. So what's the implications like for democracy? So that was my original question, but then like I ran into a big challenge that I didn't think about. Well, first of all, I thought that, so I'm going to capture all the digital campaign messages. So basically, ads. But then I realized that, all these targeted ads are only shown to the people who are targeted. So basically, if you are not targeted and then you don't see it, so there is no public archive. So it's nearly impossible to observe, who are receiving digital ads and what kind of messages these ads are about. So I was literally banging my head to the wall, and then I had an aha moment. There are ad blockers. So instead of blocking the ads, I could use the same code. So instead of blocking the ads, I could just capture the ads and then transfer the ads with the meta information, such as a landing page, URLs, and timestamp, and then transfer everything to my research server. So that was the idea.
And so this is eScope.
Yes.
Did you do this as a browser extension? What was the final model of it? It was something that people...
so it's like a typical browsing extension, collect the click streams. Whenever people click something, it captures URLs. So this one captures this one is more like an ad blocker. Yeah. So it all captures click streams, but on top of that, it captures all the ads are shown to people. So we actually know who are exposed to what message, which ad, at what time point. So that is sort of revolutionary. Still, there are not many studies who are using this direct exposure tracking method.
And does it require volunteer participation? You have to convince people to use this in their day-to-day surfing activities?
Right. That was actually the most challenging part. After we figured out how we're going to design the app, the next challenge was how to recruit people to use the app. The micro-targeting basically means that you don't do a broad reach strategy. It is you send a different message to different people. So to understand a whole scope of the data information environment, what kind of messages are out there, you need a really large sample. So people receive different messages for different reasons. Because you're a woman, because you're a man, because you are African Americans, things like that. So you need to have the sample that represents the voting age population. Therefore, you can sort of generalize whatever the findings I would get from this data. So I worked with a firm that specialized in survey recruitment and sampling. So we ended up recruiting 17,500 people who represented a U.S. voting age population.
Did eScope lead you to this? You call them dark posts. Did it lead you to the dark posts?
Right. So digital ads are essentially a targeted ads. So for example, I saw a lot of anti-Muslim ads from a certain nonprofit organization in the United States. When I visited their Facebook page, never seen those kind of anti-Muslim messages on their Facebook page. So publicly, this organization is not anti-Muslim organization, but the data we collected. This particular organization sent out all the anti-Muslim messages. So this is why digital ads got the nickname called dark posts. Yeah.
And to what extent did the changes in the Federal Election Commission rules about digital advertising change the environment of dark posts? Are there still dark posts?
Of course, yes.
I thought there was a disclaimer law that didn't.
Oh, yes. So disclaimer on so-called express advocacy ads. That passed relatively recently. Yeah. So I consider it as sort of a victory of this kind of discovery, like my research. So I actually testified at the FEC in 2018 about online disclaimer rules,
and it took them 4 years to act after you.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Finally. But it is so that's a kind of a victory. So so some political ads defined as defined as a political ads need to put a paid for by information.
Where are there still loopholes?
Loopholes is a political. It is hard to monitor this. So now we have some disclaimer rules. Somebody have to find who didn't do disclaimers, didn't put disclaimers or disclose themselves. So that is still who's going to monitor it? That's a big issue. And another thing is, AI disclosure. At the federal level, we haven't had anything yet.
There's nothing yet.
No, nothing at FEC either. Yeah. At the state level, 40 states are considering AI disclaimer rules, and I think so far 11 states enacted ahead of the election. Back to just a general political ads rule, online political ads rule. I worked with think tank who specialize in election law, and particularly I helped them write a bill Honest Ad Act. That is bipartisan act. That's still has not enacted yet. So no federal level the legislation on online political ads. So FEC level rules are implemented, but no law adequately addresses.
So the information environment, this is still going on. The kind of stuff you saw in 2016, the world hasn't changed
2016, 2020, and yeah.
Okay. In reading your 2016 research, it seemed that the significance of voter suppression, the effectiveness of these stuff is perhaps more in voter suppression than encouraging people in terms of changing outcomes in elections. That's the real sort of dark threat to democracy. Is that did I take away the
Yeah, so that is something that I want to emphasize a lot. Yeah, so when people think about a social media propaganda or disinformation, first thing people think about is it's all false information. In fact, outright lies are not, only few. It's all believable information or misleading. So I would define disinformation as not as false information, or intentionally false intentionally misleading information, but more of a function of misleading information that has the function of misleading. So for example. Neither candidate support African Americans. We don't know that's outright false or not, but it could lead people believe that election doesn't matter. So in fact, a lot of voter suppression ads are emphasizing that election doesn't matter. Neither candidate cares about us. Your vote doesn't count. So that kind of a voter suppression could be really effective when it was targeted people who are already have some barriers or constraints to turn out to vote. For example, we have gerrymandering, we have voter ID, laws, and then so there, some people can't not take a day off on the election day, and then when these people receive this kind of ads, it could be very effective. So that's what I studied.
And you found some evidence that it did have an impact. That there was
yes, this is one of the coolest studies that I'm very proud of. Is that so? What we did is so with the eScore, we collected all this basically directly measures exposure to all the ads and then so that data was combined with weekly surveys of the people who are using eScope. So by combining their survey responses to survey responses with the ads they're exposed to, because I know who are exposed to which ads, I know who respond to surveys with the particular responses. I was able to so-called reverse engineer what are the targeting profiles of certain ads. So let's say I identified voter suppression ads based on this frequent terms boycott the election, don't go to the poll, the election doesn't matter, neither candidates care about us. And then I identified who are exposed to these ads, and then by looking at the survey responses, they are non-white voters who are living in majority counties in battleground states. So we found that almost the people who are non-white voters who are living in racially minority majority counties in the battleground states received 10 times more voter suppression ads than their counterparts.
Let me just insert a question here, because I found that very compelling, and at the same time it reminded me of this BBC, I think it was Channel 4 documentary. Are you familiar with this?
Yeah, I talked to these people.
They went to this precinct and they walked around, and so let's see. As I remember it, they basically tried to find somebody who's seen a particular Facebook ad, and they couldn't find anybody in this district who had seen the ad. It was that they were looking for evidence of voter suppression, and they weren't able to find it.
It was hard to find them because, like I said, nobody's monitoring. So actually, those reporters reached out to me. Well, I know the characteristics who are exposed to it. So, my research provided some kind of evidence that their effort is not worthless. It's in their case Florida and Georgia. So we found targeting patterns, and then a next step I took was to track all of this eScope users' actual turnout record, and then I identified all the people who are exposed to voter suppression ads, and then I identified all the people who are not exposed to voter suppression ads, and then we found that voter suppression exposure did decrease the turnout about 2%.
Which in some cases was larger than the difference in the vote.
Right. When you think of this is an average population effect when we aggregate it across all people. But if we focus on people, the subgroups who are especially targeted, non-white voters who are living in the minority counties in battleground states, the difference between this group and the other group, people who are not exposed to voter suppression ads, white voters living in non-minority counties in non-battleground states, the difference between the two groups are huge.
What's fascinating to me about this discovery, the narrative, sometime later you discovered, because of the House Intelligence Committee, that the IRA, the Internet Research Agency, was playing a big role here. What I was super intrigued by is you were coming face to face with this algorithm that they were running, basically. And did you have a sense that on the other side of the wall that there were social scientists who were adversarial, who were I mean, did you have a sense that this was being run by people who were sophisticated social scientists, which I hadn't seen at the IRA? I don't know who was there, but do you have a sense of who the enemy was in this case?
Well, no, like when I first opened the data, I was actually shocked because remember, like my original research question was actually about, broader implications of a micro-targeting, especially in terms of like inequality in political involvement. And so I presume that, I would observe a lot. Obviously, this is election campaign season, so a lot of campaigns by candidates, and then probably a lot of campaigns sponsored by big, advocacy groups like NRA, NARAL, things like that. They are there, but what really what I was shocked by was they are unknown. The majority of the sponsors are unknown, and then I've been studying this for quite a long time, but even to me, I didn't recognize all these names of advocacy groups or grassroots organizations who are clearly doing a lot of large scale digital campaigns. I mean, I just jokingly so back then it was that there was some kind of rumor that Russians did interfere in the election and in social media. I was jokingly said well, maybe these are Russians, but I actually never believed that those are Russians. But when when a House Intelligence Committee in almost 1 year later, they released some part of the data with the meta information, I matched with that information, House Intel information with my data, and then they're exactly the same. So the groups that I set aside as just the suspicious, undisclosed groups, about 17% of them turned out to be Russian groups. And then they are, people say some people who study Russian propaganda say they are not so sophisticated. Sometimes they made grammatical error, but I thought they are pretty they had a pretty good understanding of American society because they are clearly exploiting the deep social and political divide in our society. So they are not creating division, but they are taking advantage of the divides, mistrust in the government, media, mainstream media, or just a general distrust people, especially people who have a different background.
In the seminar, you briefly brought up this concept of algorithmic opportunity. How does that fit into this?
So I use the term algorithm opportunity to emphasize a structural and systematic aspect. And after all, I analyze the data and then finding this the information environment, my conclusion is how the data-driven information environment propels inequality in political involvement. Just Long Island overpasses it just occurred to me. So Robert Monzel, who is an architect in early 1920s, he designed the whole overpass in Long Island. He designed overpasses so low that mass transportation buses couldn't pass through the overpasses. If you pass through the overpasses, then there is a John Speech Park. So it is a public park, but because only those who could afford cars could pass overpasses and then could enjoy the John Speech Park. So that even if it's a public park, is defined in a completely different way. The meaning of a public has changed to people who could afford the cars. So I think this algorithmic opportunity is the same kind of a thing. So I call it algorithmic overpass. So it just inadvertently, propels, or maybe not inadvertently. Some people have like a deliberate intentions, some campaigns. So if we think about like this political inequalities, like inequality means like unequal distribution of political information and unequal representation in political participation. Previous researchers identified like root causes for this unequal distribution of political information and unequal representation in political participation as motivations and then ability. So people who do not have like a ability to understand like a complexity of politics, that's why there is like a inequality happens, or people do not have motivation, are not interested in politics. But these are all like individual level factors, I would say. And I pay more attention to systemic, structural, obviously like technological factors. So I view information environment. So instead of like just looking at like a one technology, like a digital or broadcast media, conceptualize the whole technology as like information ecology or information system or information environment, then viewing that as like a more structural or systemic issue. I would say the information environment like sets a certain condition for amplifying some activities, political behavior, or limiting some political behavior. So like a mobilizing and a demobilization. So I see it as like an opportunity. So some people have a lot of opportunity to consume mobilizing political information, get out the vote, or learning about like all kinds of political issues. But because of this like a targeting ability, some people never get it received, never get exposed to certain types of like information. So some of the studies like I did before had like some empirical evidence that like for example like Hispanic Latino voters like spend a lot of time online relative to other like racial ethnic groups. However, they do not get a lot of political information. Younger voters, relatively speaking, they receive like less political information. First-time voters or immigrants, they receive like less political information. Why is that? Like, the first step of this like a stage that like where this like discrepancies like happen is like a data these campaigners use. So the baseline data campaigners use, no matter what kind of campaigns that they do, is voter files, so the history of turnout. And then that has actually have like its strongest predictive power. So the people who turned out to vote last election is more likely to turn out to vote like at this election, right? So basically, younger voters have a relatively shorter history of voting, and therefore they generate less data points. Therefore, they have like a less predictive power. So they are sort of like filtered out. Same thing with like immigrants. Then like the second stage of it is like a micro-targeting. So the micro-targeting is that like campaigners have a lot of information, and then they identify and target who's going to mobilize, who's going to demobilize. They determine, right? This information asymmetry, and then they always have their interests. And as I explained like earlier, why do they do like a voter suppression campaigns? Because it's much easier to do that, to persuade, compared to like persuading like people, or persuading people who are not so much interested in politics, or converting like people from one side to the other side. Targeted people who already resentful about the election, and who already have like barriers to turn out to vote, and just to nudge them, just to confirm that their beliefs that election doesn't matter. So we'll see this kind of like unequal representation. Other studies like I did like in 2020, we happened to capture the Jan 6 insurrection, and then these like undisclosed campaigns, like targeted conspiracy groups. They are generalized conspiracy groups. Like they are not like particularly political, but then like talked about like election, and then connects this election outcomes like with their general conspirational beliefs about society. So then these people are heavily mobilized for Stop the Steal quote-unquote movement, and then they are organized for insurrections. So if we think about this patterns from a bird eye view, so you see as a result of micro-targeting, the data-driven information environment might propel inequality in political involvement by amplifying extremist voices. Therefore, they are overrepresented. But by limiting already marginalized voters, therefore these marginalized voters are underrepresented. So the gap between these two groups are even wider.
It seems like you've identified the flip side of Citizens United in a strange way. I don't know. That's my...
Exactly. Yeah. So Citizens United, I think Supreme Court judges didn't think about this the implications of the future information environment. So it inadvertently opened the door to foreign elections, and it facilitates this undisclosed campaigns. And then, information environment provides some venue where undisclosed campaigns could flourish.
Thank you. This was really illuminating for me, so I appreciate it.
Thank you.
That was Young Mie Kim in conversation with John Markoff. As always, you can follow us online or in your podcast app of choice. And if you're interested in learning more about the Center's people, projects, and rich history, you can visit our website at casbs.stanford.edu. Until next time, from everyone at CASBS and the Human-Centered team, thanks for listening.